Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're just on 4 o'clock, so I'm sure some people are just joining in, but we might just start with a bit of an introduction to our latest IWEA webinar, Supplying 30 Gigawatts to Europe. So this has been a very exciting target that has been set in the programme for government that was agreed only a few months ago. I think it has certainly accelerated the interest in what Ireland can do in terms of contributing towards Europe decarbonisation transition. And so we here in IWEA felt after this target being set in the programme for government, it'd be a great time to bring people who have a lot of experience in this area together and just start hearing what's the latest and greatest that's happening in the space of Ireland becoming not just using our wind energy to solve our own decarbonisation issues, but actually trying to help Europe decarbonise its energy system as well. Delighted to have such a great panel on the webinar today. We'll be running order. We'll go from left to right, as you see on the slide here that's hopefully in front of your screens. We'll start with Michael Mahon, Chief Infrastructure Officer from EirGrid. He's going to tell us all how we build the infrastructure, the grid infrastructure that we need. So really looking forward to that. That'll be followed up by Niall Goodwin, who's a policy advisor to Sean Kelly, our MEP in the European Parliament. Sean and Niall have been instrumental in setting the 2030 renewable energy targets at an EU level in recent times. So I'm sure he's going to give us some interesting insights as to what's happening in Brussels in this space. Then we'll have Val Cummins from Simply Blue Energy, only recently moved from academia into Simply Blue. So like myself, has come from the academic background into the world of IWEA. But not only has she moved to Simply Blue, she's also taken up the role as the chair of our floating offshore wind working group in IWEA, the recently established working group. So she's very much leading light within the IWEA conversation in this space and then give us some of her perspectives on that. And then finally, we'll end with Eddie O'Connor from Mainstream and Supernode, who's been championing the idea of Ireland becoming a contributor to Europe's decarbonisation agenda for many years now. So has a lot of homework done in this space and really looking forward to getting his thoughts as well. But just to begin, the first few slides, I'm just going to say a few words as moderator to kind of kickstart the discussions. Before I get going, I just wanted to make an acknowledgement to the recent passing of Brendan Halligan on the 9th of August, a real inspiration in the Irish energy sector over many years. I had the pleasure of meeting him on a few occasions and even took me for a trip in his Toyota Prius many moons ago, and he'd be sadly missed, and he really had a huge role to play in Ireland's achievements to date in wind energy and beyond from many of his various roles. So just want to acknowledge that, since it's the first large gathering we've had in IWEA since his sad passing at the start of August. The other thing I just want to mention is that in the IWEA upcoming conference, which is going to be virtual this year due to COVID, unfortunately, restricting us from getting together in our usual numbers as we've done in the past. But we're going to try and make the most of this virtual event. And as part of that, on the first day, on the 21st, we have a session dedicated to this 30 gigawatt story. So we can look forward to not just today's webinar, but a few follow-up discussions on the 21st of September. And Val and Eddie will be on that session as well, along with a number of other speakers. So just if people are interested in hearing more of the discussion after today, do join us at our conference in September. So just the last bit of admin then is Slido. We'll just have Slido for Q&A, the hashtag 30 gigawatts. If you put that in, you'll be able to send a Q&A to the panel and it'll come up when we get to the Q&A session. We're going to start with a 5-minute intro from each of the panelists, and then we'll open up for Q&A for the last half of the webinar. We've put up 2 polls on Slido as well. If the IT facilitates, we're going to do these polls both before and after to see if the panelists have changed your views through the presentation. The first one on the left is live about what you think is the best way for Ireland to supply 30 gigawatts to Europe. And straight after that one, we'll be asking, when do you think this is going to be possible to achieve by? So just get ready on Slido if you want to send a question your own or to answer these polls. When we get to the end of my few slides, we'll ask those 2 questions, and then we'll ask them again maybe at the end of the webinar if time and IT permits. But for me, starting off, I have 3 very simple messages that I think are grounded in some really interesting numbers. My first message is Ireland has a lot of wind energy. And I think I've said this numerous times in my role in IWEA, but I want to just emphasize it as my first point again. It's not just about Ireland having a lot of wind energy, it's around how unique we are in having a lot of wind energy. So in my old job, I used to work on a lot of EU projects, making energy strategies for different countries. It is astonishing how many EU countries out there just simply don't have the renewable resources they need, not alone to help Europe decarbonize, but just to satisfy their own needs for renewable energy over the next 20 to 30 years. So we're very unique in this situation with a handful of other member states, maybe the likes of Denmark, Scotland. There's a few countries that happen to have huge amounts of renewable energy in excess of what they actually need. For Ireland, as you can see, SEI predicted we have about 16 gigawatts of onshore, 30 gigawatts of offshore. The Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan predicted we have 30 to 40 gigawatts of offshore. Right now we've only used 4 gigawatts of wind energy, almost exclusively onshore wind in Ireland. So we have just started to utilize this fantastic resource that's available to us in Ireland. And I think we need to think of Ireland in that mindset that this is a fantastic resource that we can utilize to help other countries decarbonize their energy system. To reflect that, if you just look, we published a report back in May with Carbon Trust, where we looked at the current list of projects that are in active development. This is due for update in the next number of weeks. We've just finished a survey with our members, so it's slightly outdated. But in that time, there was about 13 gigawatts of offshore projects in active development. In our new survey, we know it's closer to 16. And look, the Irish target is to have at least 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The programme for government sees 5,000 megawatts, as updated that to 5,000. So the principal message I'm trying to get across here is it's not just a theoretical resource that we have. Active projects in development have demonstrated that this resource is real. And it's just about how do we use it in time? Because if we only need 5 gigawatts of this by 2030, there's a huge abundance of resource to be used there for other needs beyond our needs and beyond 2030. The second thing I would like to just flag at the start is Europe will need a lot of wind energy. And this is not just because wind decarbonizes electricity, but it's because wind is going to be needed to decarbonize heat and transport also. And so what I've just put in here is some of the European Commission's forecasts as to what they think Europe will need in terms of wind energy by 2050. As you can see, it's about 1,200 gigawatts of wind energy that they forecast they will need. So 30 gigawatts is only 2.5% of what Europe will need. So they're going to need an awful lot. And I think that's back to, Ireland is in a unique position where we have a lot. Europe is going to need an awful lot. There isn't many countries that can put their hand up and say, yes, we have the resource you need in the future to decarbonize. So I think it's not just an opportunity for Ireland. I think we just have a responsibility here to contribute to the European decarbonisation agenda because they're going to need it. Other countries are going to be short, and hopefully that figure there puts the scale of what the need is. The third thing I have is, rather than an opinion, it's a question, and maybe something the panelists can think about as they go through their own slides. I think for me, it's obvious we have lots of it. For me, it's obvious that Europe is going to need lots of it. But the kind of bit that I think I would like IWEA and many others to kind of put a bit more thought into in the coming months is just exactly how we do it, what technologies exactly we use, and how we then go about delivering it. So for example, the very promising things I've come across are the supergrid idea that I'm sure Eddie will talk about a bit later, building cables directly into a European grid and supplying our wind energy that way. The other option is to produce fuels here in Ireland, clean fuel. So producing hydrogen, for example, from wind energy, and then exporting our hydrogen as a clean fuel to Europe. Another option is to locate high demand industries in Ireland that need electricity, like data centers and other industries that have a high demand for electricity. If we have lots of clean electricity, we're an ideal location for these heavy consumers in Europe, and then export the products that they produce. A huge opportunity, in my opinion, there, and something I know the data center community are obviously many times flagging as a huge opportunity for Ireland to grow an industry out of. And I think once we start to understand better about how we use these new technology options to maximize the use of our wind energy in Ireland, it's then how do we go about delivering it? Because this is something of scale that I think is beyond what we've traditionally used as levers to deliver in Ireland. So, domestically, we have a lot of experience at delivering wind energy, but, 30 gigawatts is beyond anything our domestic tools, let's say, have been used to delivering. So there may be new ways of thinking required there. And these are some of the questions that I really love to discuss today on the webinar. And at that, I'll stop talking and leave it over to the experts to give their thoughts on these type of questions that I've posed to them. Before I pass over to Michael, who's going to take us through his first talks, we might just flick and see did many people vote for the in the Slido that I teed people up on. So I'll just very briefly move over to the Slido and let's see if we've had many votes in. So we've had 23 and 61% think it's supergrid directly to Europe, 22% high demand industries located in Ireland, and 13% hydrogen. So let's see if there's any change in that as the poll progresses. The second one I have, if people have Slido active on their phone now, we might just give it 30 seconds and see if people can vote on how soon do you think Ireland can deliver this. So we've had one in, so we know it's working, at least 4. Let's see what the results are. Interesting. So the 2040 to 2050 timescale seems to be the runner. Very good. So look, that'll give people a flavor of what the audience think before we hand over to the panelists. And let's see how that changes maybe as the presentations progress and the speakers give their views on how this could be done. So Michael, with no further ado, I'll hand you the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Just kicking off, I suppose David asked me to give you an update on the Celtic Interconnector project. As at the moment, it's the only planned connection we have to Europe. And since January with Brexit, we don't actually have any connection with the European Union. So on the first slide, please, David. The Celtic Interconnector project is a new direct connection from Ireland to the European continental grid. It's a joint venture between EirGrid and our equivalent in France, RTE. It's a 700 megawatt connection using HVDC technology. And the cable length from Cork to France is just under 575 kilometers. And the next slide, please, David. The project enhances the supply of the security of supply in Ireland and France by providing additional supply of power and increased diversification of energy sources. And to be honest, this is probably why the project was conceived originally, but the goal was really around security supply and focus on interconnected and intermesh grids. The next slide, the project facilitates increased trading, resulting in downward pressure on the cost of electricity to consumers, and it'll actually provide a connection with the single electricity market in Ireland to the French market and then to the EU internal market. On the next slide, we're just talking about essentially what I think is essential now, which is the development. The project's essential to the development of intermittent renewable generation sources in Ireland. And that's I think now one of the kind of the key reasons why the Celtic Interconnection project is actually so important to us. On the next slide, what we're showing is that like we're well progressed with the project. In terms of the marine route, we've defined the kind of all the exact route from Castle Beach in Cork to the Martier in France. You can see some of the challenges we have with 497 kilometers of offshore cable, and variable seabed geology requiring different cable installation techniques and trenching to rock dumping in places where it's not practical to do that, and to do it effectively through 3 jurisdictions. So Irish waters, UK the UK economic zone, and actually French waters as well. In terms of the next slide, in terms of where we are with the project, in terms of timeline, or sorry, where we are in terms of the funding for the project, we applied to Europe last year for the Connecting Europe facility for a grant, and last October we were successful in obtaining a 530 million euro grant, which goes a long way to the estimated capital cost of the project of about 950 million. In terms of timeline, we're well progressed with the project. We're currently working through the more detailed design and route selection studies on the onshore side. We're aiming to start the pre-qualification process in the next few months, and the formal consenting process is going to start, if not at the end of Q1 next year, very early in Q2 2021. And we're expecting EPC contract awards to be placed by the end of 2022. In 2022, then, when you're looking at a kind of an end of construction date in 2026, we need 3 summer seasons effectively to lay the cable on the offshore. And so that's why we need to kind of get this contract awarded in 2022. then the last slide then, I just want to highlight that from an EirGrid point of view, interconnection is actually absolutely essential to the strategy, and the strategy that we're focused on to try and support Ireland in achieving the 2030 sustainability targets and the 70% by 2030. It's essential to onboarding additional renewables to support that intermittent nature and to achieving the SNSP targets we set out. As well as Celtic, we're also supporting the Greenlink project and working with that, working with the developer to support the development and delivery of that project. And we expect and it's planned that that project will be in operation in advance of the Celtic project. And finally then, just a note on rounding off that we're actively working on the delivery of the Climate Action Plan targets, interconnection, but also offshore. We're pleased with the amount of progress that's being made in the offshore space, and look forward to kind of working with the industry, the department and the CRU to deliver those targets by 2030. Beyond 2030, increased connectivity, storage and hydrogen is going to become increasingly important to achieve the zero carbon target we set out for 2050. And as it takes time to develop these projects, and as we can see from Celtic and other projects, suggests that this work starts now, while not losing sight on the short-term target of 2030. From an EirGrid point of view, my colleague Liam Ryan and the Planning Innovation team are very focused on the 2030 targets, but are also looking beyond that to 2050, including kind of our current participation in the North Seas Energy Cooperation, which supports the development of offshore grid and our large renewable energy potential with our European partners. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. So I think that concludes our first speakers. The second up, we have Niall. So Niall, hopefully your camera is in good operation. I'll leave the floor to yourself.
That's great. Thanks very much, David. You can hear me and see me?
I can.
Great. So yeah, firstly, I just take the opportunity to thank David and IWEA for the invitation to participate at the panel discussion this afternoon, and the opportunity to bring something of an EU perspective to this kind of very important and exciting topic. For those that don't know me, I'll just give a quick introduction. As David said, I work in the European Parliament in Brussels for Sean Kelly, MEP for Ireland South, and mainly on the Parliament's Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, so relevant to the issues we're discussing today. As most of you will know, Sean Kelly was what we call the rapporteur for the largest grouping in the Parliament on the Renewable Energy Directive. And so that's, given myself an opportunity to work with him on these policies, and, a bit of a claim to fame was I was able to be in the room for the delivery of the 32% target. So just to fast forward to today, there's no doubt that we're at a very important juncture at EU level now for the renewable energy sector. The communication on the European Green Deal in December 2019, along with the 2050 climate neutrality target and the proposal to increase the overall ambition for 2030, they show clearly that climate action is a central priority of this new Commission, and wind energy will certainly have an important role to play. I think the coming months in particular could be crucial for setting out the frameworks for the delivery of offshore renewables at the scale that we're talking about today, with initiatives ongoing such as proposals to increase the ambition for 2030, the overall outlook to 2050, the offshore renewable energy strategy, which we expect next month, the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive, which should kick off next year, and then progress on other related policy issues such as the 10E regulation, the hydrogen strategy and the systems integration strategy. So just to briefly give a state of play on 2030 and longer term ambition, given I suppose that's the driving force behind everything else. Work is already ongoing on the climate law, which will legally set the target of climate neutrality by 2050. And next month, the Commission will present its impact assessed proposal to increase the 2030 target from 40% currently up to at least 50 and probably 55%. The past 12 months have really brought a step up in ambition at EU level. That's largely through the work of Vice President for the Green Deal, Frans Timmermans. But also, I think it should be mentioned that we have a new European Parliament in place now it's really pushing the agenda even more than it had been before. I'd say it's probably the most ambitious Parliament there has been, and there's no doubt that there will be a strong push for higher targets across the board, and notably on renewable energy. And as I mentioned, there's a review due on the Renewable Energy Directive, and already in the agreement from 2018, there's an upward revision clause included in there. So we will expect that target to go up. I suppose in short, in terms of high-level ambition and the longer-term visibility for investment, things are only going to get better for the renewable energy sector in the months and years ahead. The other kind of key element that's been talked about and about to be on the table is the offshore wind strategy. And I suppose it's one that's highly anticipated in the so-called EU energy policy bubble. And all signs are that it will be a kind of an important flagship document for Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson. The Green Deal itself notes that we need to avail of the EU's vast offshore resources in order to meet our long-term ambition. And in recent months, DG ENER officials have been consulting stakeholders. Many of them could well be logged onto this discussion in order to make sure that they get this strategy right. The Commissioner talking about the need to drastically upscale offshore deployment to at least 20 times the level it is today. And the figures being mentioned are between 2030 and 450 gigawatts. The Commission see the sector as strategically important for the EU's economic recovery post-COVID, and also important for the strengthening of its industrial competitiveness. And this also goes hand in hand with the hydrogen strategy launched last month. Another relevant point, which is kind of linked to what both David and Michael said, is that the revision of the 10E regulation is also going to be a big part of that, and that sets out the framework to determine the PCI list. So that'll be a core part, and that will, be the driving force behind increasing interconnection. I suppose particularly relevant for today's discussion is that there will be a strong cross-border dimension to the strategy, and this ties into David's question at the start. We would expect the strategy will, in some form, outline plans for a kind of a long-term regional cooperation framework and planning framework for the purpose of boosting offshore development. We know that realizing 30 gigawatts is a challenge, so that kind of regional cooperation element could be important for, financing the deployment and driving the investment in terms of, Ireland becoming a major supplier. And this also builds on provisions that are already in the clean energy package, where the Commission and Parliament in particular pushed the importance of this dimension. The governance regulation, for example, that creates a new financing mechanism for renewables that aim to facilitate the cost-effective deployment, specifically in areas best suited for them in terms of geography and natural resources. And the aim is that will be operational by the beginning of 2021. The so-called Implementing Act is now being revised. Additionally, the Renewable Energy Directive sought to enhance that regional cooperation element through joint projects, joint support schemes, and the opening of support schemes to producers located in other member states. Now, the outcome of that in the end wasn't as ambitious as the original proposal, but as I said, with that directive to be revisited kicking off next year, we could well see a push for more ambition on that, and some maybe even the possibility of mandatory opening of support schemes. And I know in Ireland's National Climate and Energy Plan, there are some elements of opening the support schemes to external participants. Just a quick word on hydrogen, which has really come to the fore in Brussels policy discussions in recent months. The strategy launched last month in particular seems particularly positive for the acceleration of renewable energy deployment, and it prioritises the development of renewable hydrogen, noting the need to connect 80 to 100 gigawatt of solar and wind energy production capacity to electrolyzers in order to provide the necessary electricity. So that's quite positive, and it necessitates the need for more renewable electricity. I'd be particularly interested to hear from the three experts that we have here today, just on the role of hydrogen, how they see it. I know it's related to the question earlier. There will be a debate on this in Brussels, particularly around the level of support to be given to non-renewable hydrogen, which the Commission envisage as a sort of transition fuel, while investments and technologies are developed towards having renewable hydrogen, green hydrogen, by say 2030 and ramping that up. So I'd be interested to hear what others have to say on that. And I suppose just to finish, I think it's clear that there is a lot happening at EU level on this. Kind of similarly to the ambition on offshore outlined in the programme for government, there's similar ambitions at EU level. And important long-term policies, some of which I've mentioned, are now being decided, which will have an impact on Ireland's offshore sector. And we see from the clean energy package that big changes that in EU policy, they have big impacts on us at national level a little while down the line there. So I think now more than ever, I think it's vitally important that key decision makers, key policy makers in Brussels at EU level are made fully aware of this role that Ireland can play. You know, what David outlined at the start, that the potential that we have to be a major supplier of renewable energy. I think that has to be crystal clear and needs to be communicated well at EU level. You know, our vast potential needs to be central to these strategies. And decision makers at all stages, be they desk officers, heads of units, or the commissioner themselves, they need to be aware of this. And I'd certainly take the opportunity to encourage you know, the wind energy industry here today to kind of, you know, make sure you engage on this topic at EU level as possible. Make sure that they see it as a priority, because you can be sure that other regions, you know, the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, project promoters there will be doing that. I suppose I'll leave it there. I'm happy to kind of join the discussion and take questions later, but I suppose that would be my leaving message, just to kind of make sure that this is engaged.
Super, that's great. Thanks a lot, Niall. I think we'll, conscious of time, Val, if hopefully your video is working as well, I'll leave the floor to you next.
Great. Thanks a million, David, and to everybody in IWEA for facilitating this discussion in relation to the future of offshore wind in Ireland, and particularly floating offshore wind, which is such a unique opportunity. And so, you know, starting this process in terms of looking forward, it always, I think, can be helpful to just pause for a moment and look back. And with that in mind, my first slide here, just for a moment, I've put up an image, or images rather, from Ardnacrusha in relation to the Shannon hydroelectric scheme. And I think it's just extremely relevant in the context of the time we're in now. The fact that this project was completed within 7 years of Irish independence in 1922, with a cost equivalent to 1/5 of the Irish state's annual budget at the time, and the scheme resulting in the construction of a national power grid and 85 megawatts, equivalent to the electricity demand of the entire country, roughly at that period. So we've proven that we can think big and be bold and be impactful in the past. And this project is a fantastic example of a transformation initiative, and it serves the country well in terms of the economic backbone that we were able to build from. And I suppose what I would posit is that floating offshore wind, or FLOW, is actually our 21st century Ardnacrusha. But actually the stakes are higher. Just last week, NASA and NOAA published papers to say that last year was the hottest, or the second hottest ever recorded. And so this coming decade, as we all know, is absolutely critical to reverse the worst implications of climate change. But we need to learn from the past in order to protect the future. And fundamentally, I think it's hugely welcome that the government and the programme for government has set out this vision for 30 gigawatts of floating wind. But it's all about leadership and delivery. So I think this conversation, in terms of the next slide, please, is really important. And from our point of view in Simply Blue Energy, we're absolutely committed to playing our part in relation to the energy transition. For those of you who don't know us, one of our big floating projects is off the coast of Wales. The Erebus project is seeking to deliver 96 megawatts of floating wind. Earlier this year, we signed a joint venture partnership with Total. Just yesterday, there was a press release, some people might have seen it, in relation to the lease that we have acquired from the Crown Estate. And just in terms of some recent statistics coming out of that project, with regards to local content in the supply chain, the figures at the moment are up around 84%. So huge opportunities. Come across the water from Wales to Ireland. Ireland is such an exciting emerging market for FLOW right now. Not least because of that signal in relation to the programme for government. And our ambition as a company is to repeat the model over the other side of the Celtic Sea and the Irish Sea here. And recently we've initiated our work in terms of our foreshore site investigation licence application for our Emerald project, which has a vision for delivering 1 gigawatt of floating wind in the vicinity of the Kinsale gas platform, which is, I suppose, an energy transition initiative when you think of the opportunity for change there from gas to renewables. If we go to the next slide, David, I suppose from the Simply Blue Energy perspective, we're well positioned to inform the discussion around floating in an Irish context. And I think that it's really interesting to note the 30 gigawatts from the programme for government being referred to in the context of the Atlantic. And without a shadow of a doubt, the Atlantic is an enormous opportunity. Ireland. But where will the 30 gigawatts come from? I believe it's not just the Atlantic, but that we need a sequenced approach. And that the Celtic Sea commissioned that Ireland is a small domestic market in relation to demands for electricity. We know that there will be strong growth in relation to data centres and a need for CPPAs, for example. We also know that there's an opportunity to export electricity, and we'll be hearing from Eddie in relation to the opportunity with respect to SuperGrid. And of course, a really strong argument, undoubtedly, that electricity, without a shadow of a doubt, is the best vector for energy when it comes to efficiencies. But we must also consider what was mentioned in the previous presentation, which is the opportunity around hydrogen. And the EU hydrogen strategy that was published most recently projects a growth from the current rates of hydrogen production in Europe's energy mix from 2% to 14% by 2050. And there's a huge opportunity in terms of replacing fossil fuels in carbon-intensive industrial processes such as oil refining and so on. There's opportunities in terms of avoiding stranded assets such as pipelines going forward and reutilization of natural gas infrastructure. We have 14,000 kilometers of natural gas pipelines in this country. There's an opportunity for blending hydrogen. And of course, that hydrogen, from our point of view and our business interest, really coming from green hydrogen. I think the conversation or the point was made earlier in relation to other sources of hydrogen and this transition from grey to blue to green in terms of how hydrogen is produced. I think we need to be fast forwarding and thinking about, the opportunity that starts now is really taking a strategic view in terms of that green hydrogen production. And of course, some solutions in transport systems with regards to heavy goods vehicles and long distance travel in relation to hydrogen for transport also. So we know that the Commission is supporting the installation of at least 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers in the EU by 2024, and up to 40 gigawatts by 2030 in terms of renewable hydrogen electrolyzer distribution and rollout. So that's phenomenal in terms of an intent to grow. And I think that Ireland needs to seize that opportunity. So I don't think it's a question of either or. I think it's about being super smart in terms of really fine-tuning an approach to route to market. And number two here, in terms of how do we get there with regards to those numbers around 30 gigawatts. How do we get to that point in terms of the feedback from the presentations earlier on, whether it's 2040 or 2050? Point number two here, I think, is absolutely critical path stuff in relation to we need to do a national route to market strategy. And we need to look deeply at that question around, is it interconnectors, is it supergrid, is it hydrogen, and what will serve the needs most appropriately to seize this opportunity for floating, considering the abundance of wind, the vast resources. And David, the presentation you made at the start in terms of the market on our doorstep in terms of energy requirements for a European marketplace. Other key points here in terms of how do we get there and the critical path. Point number one, fundamentally, here and now, we need extra staffing in the relevant government departments and agencies. We also need to see a roadmap now for pre-commercial demonstration auctions for floating wind in terms of RES. We need to see, I suppose, specific plans for the Celtic Sea and the Atlantic production zones for floating wind, given the different characteristics of both, given the fact that the Celtic Sea may come on stream before the Atlantic, given the fact that we need to focus on driving down the levelized cost of energy. In the Airwind studies, we were looking at the Celtic Sea for a 1 gigawatt project coming on stream at the end of the decade, an LCOE of around €75 per megawatt hour. And for a similar scenario off the west coast, you're up at 108 euros per megawatt hour. So we need to be getting those costs down. So we need to be sensible in terms of a roadmap with timelines for both of those areas. And finally, most importantly, we can do all the engineering, we can do all the reduction of levelized cost of energy, and we can do all the strategizing in terms of electrons versus molecules. But fundamentally, we won't be going anywhere or achieving anything unless we have a social license to operate. And I think another critical path piece is being proactive in terms of developing partnerships with stakeholders and taking that opportunity that we understand with regards to flow outside of this community and everybody that's on this session, and maybe in a way it's preaching to the converted, and taking it out into civil society where we can really achieve some buy-in to the opportunity that we're presented now, our 21st century art in Croatia. Thanks, David.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Val. And finally then, Eddie, hopefully your IT is okay. So if you want to turn on your own video, then we'll run through your own slides.
Yeah, how are we going now? Do you see me?
I do. Yeah, loud and clear.
Look at you.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Well, first of all, I think it's, I want to thank the IWEA for organizing this event. We're actually facing into one of the most challenging periods in the history of power. You're showing, you can show the next slide here. I'm speaking here on account of, on behalf of this company that we set up a couple of years ago. It's headed up by John Fitzgerald, who's built the East-West Interconnector. And we're developing a new technology which is going to lead to the next slide, please, David, which is the SuperGrid. The European Commission has said that there'll be 450,000 megawatts built offshore. Our calculation actually is more like 900,000, because they said they were going to build 700,000 megawatts on land. And I don't believe that we're going to be able to build anything like that on land. Community resistance is increasing all the time, even in Ireland, but particularly now in Germany. So how are we going to get power from the Irish Sea, the Celtic Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the floating of Portugal and the Mediterranean? How are we going to get all that power to where the customers are? And how are we going to power countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, and all the way almost down to the Mediterranean, because they have almost no resources. So we're looking into something here that requires an enormous amount of planning, something that Europe has never done before, and actually probably doesn't think it has a jurisdiction to do. So we need to see a vast change at European level, even going way beyond the great stuff that Niall has reported on earlier on. And how do we deal with the variability of wind and solar? And this was dealt with in the first presenter. Well, when you build a grid from northern Norway down to the Mediterranean, first of all, you've got solar and you've got wind together. In summertime, the solar is very strong and the wind is a little bit weak up north. And in the wintertime, the wind is very strong and the solar is a bit weak down the south. So the supergrid allows for a balancing effect here. And also we're going to have to put in storage on land. I don't think we build any storage at sea. And the more electricity, or the more grid that you have in place, the less storage you'll have to have. And if we just kind of flick on to the next slide, then we think about, we need a single market in Europe for our electricity. This is Wind Europe has published this and shows the contribution from various areas. But how is Ireland going to harmonise, or going to work with the rest of Europe to harmonise our prices? Because we're looking into the integration and unification of all power generation, transmission and distribution in Europe. And what kind of a regulatory regime does the Irish government want to see across Europe? From our viewpoint, we want to see free access to all nations for electricity and private sector involvement in grid building to ensure innovation and lowering the cost. And just as we did with opening up the generation space for competition in 1999. And the way that we have chosen to do this, if you take the next slide, David, this is a superconductor. At minus 200 degrees using liquid nitrogen, you can actually transport vast quantities of electricity. And that's why SuperNode was set up, to be able to produce this for DC. so that we could build a grid which was capable of transferring vast quantities of electricity. This is the most exciting project I've ever been involved in my life. We are going to collect, we'll be going to the public markets later on this year. It works. It's in place in Germany. It's in place in Korea, where I visited last year. And so we need to see a lot of R&D in this space. Now, if we go on to the next slide, there are 11 departments involved with floating offshore wind in Ireland. 11 departments. And how is coordination across government departments to be organised, given that there are these 11 people? I mean, they don't talk to one another naturally. The Department of Housing, Department of the Environment, Department of Energy, IDA, Enterprise Ireland, the Department of Finance. Who is going to be the one department that's the supremo here? We have to get that right, because you can't have 11 departments all working together to try and do something. And what about the hugely important role for our ports here? What strategy does the government have for building our ports so that they can have lay down areas for all the turbines, so that they can have experimental areas to determine where those turbines are to be built, so they can have the underwater drones, so that we can have specialist ships built in Ireland? Is this not a really important task for the IDA? And it's very exciting. I was at Wind Europe demonstration in Copenhagen there last November. Extremely interesting to see the number of new ships that had come on stream in the last 2 or 3 years. And we don't even know what kind of floating platforms that we need offshore. We don't know what kind of ships that are going to be needed to service those. And we don't have a real fix on the water depth, on where are the dolphins, where are the critical bird sanctuaries. All this kind of stuff needs to be done. And we've got 10 years to do it, or else we lose out. And just on, finally, because we could talk for a long time about all of these issues, but 30 gigawatts of wind is going to cost in the order of 450 billion. And by the way, the Supernode company that we've set up will reduce the cost of transmitting electricity by about 50%. But even at that, it's going to cost us 450 billion. And how can the SME sector be incentivized to develop the intellectual property that will underpin so much of this development? Has the Green IFSC a role to play in providing funding? And look at what the government gets. If we have 30,000 megawatts and we generate it at 50 euros, and the government takes 2.5% for leasing the seabed, well, they would make every year, without having any work to do, 213.5 million that would come to their coffers. So there is this vast amount of work that has to be done in preparation for decarbonising Europe, using around between 900,000 and 1 million megawatts offshore, and connecting all that and linking it to the people where they are. I think I'll stop at that, David. Great,
thanks very much, Eddie. Look, sure, you can leave your camera on there, Eddie. We might all come back on. I'll stop sharing the slides just for the Q&A. Look, as moderator, I might just take advantage of having the floor to myself to get started. Like you can see from a few presentations there, between anything that even touched on the EU story, the scale of what's to be delivered is enormous. Like when you think that we've got 4 gigawatts of almost exclusively onshore wind in Ireland, you're talking tens of gigawatts, whether it's, and it sounds to me now like the policymakers even recognize that now and are looking at solutions, but it seems to be strange in a way that, let's say, our poll suggested the direct connection was the absolute majority preference. It sounds like the EU policymaking space is almost in the hydrogen bubble to the vast degree, and much more in that space than they are in the kind of direct electricity connections. And I think you might have mentioned it, Val, and that really struck me, is like perhaps what we're missing here is just a bit more of a detailed message around how the different pieces all come together. So right now they're all so high level as ideas. There's, let's say, maybe a nuance around, well, where does one meet the other? That's probably a gap, but so scale looks enormous. But like I'll leave the floor open to people. Like how do you start on a journey that, let's say, for the last 15 years has delivered 4 gigawatts, and over the next 15 to 20 has to deliver 10 times that, probably, at least? Like where is the starting point for that? Like I think, Niall, you made a good one. Get involved in the EU policy making. That sounds like an essential thing for Ireland to do. Eddie, change in dynamics, so people look across the whole region, maybe not just themselves with the grids, private development of grids, that'd be probably a major change. So any reflections? Maybe I'll pass around the panel. Like, where do you start on a journey? Because it seems like everyone recognizes the scale, but just getting started for me seems like the one thing that's the tricky thing to navigate.
Everything starts, David, if I might just kick off, everything starts with government policy. And in Europe, it's our experience that everything really starts at European policy, because we would never have opened up the Irish market and built those 4 gigawatts you're talking about of onshore wind without a directive coming from Europe, Directive 96/92 EC, which opened up the market. And where is the innovation in grids up to now? I mean, whether if you do a little bit of hydrogen and basically, there will be some hydrogen, because 70 million tons of it are used in the world to feed our chemical industries. But electric cars are just so much cheaper than hydrogen fuel cars. Home heating using heat pumps is 3 times more efficient using electricity. Electricity is the vector for the future. But everything starts with government policy. And I have seen no attempt here in Ireland to really start to dig into the roots of this. How does the government, with 11 different departments, how do you lease offshore land? Who adjudicates on planning permission for the offshore seabed? Where's the R&D going? What kind of platforms do we need in the kind of swells, the 10, 12 meter swells that you get off the west coast? What kind of a platform suitable for that? We have to test out platforms there. We've 11 meter a second wind speeds. We've 65% capacity factors. But where is the plan, the government plan to do this?
It's really interesting that you say that, because Niall, it sounds to me like if EU is the place to start, it is absolutely hot right now with activity around what needs to be done. I think you just even taken a few notes: integration strategy, hydrogen strategy, offshore strategy, Green Deal. I think you even mentioned it, Ireland really needs to be central to those discussions. I'd imagine if things start at EU policy level, it sounds like that's happening as we speak.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I absolutely get what Eddie is saying as well. That these kind of things have been driven by policies before, and when I was kind of preparing for today, trying to fit in a mention of all the things that are happening on energy policy in Brussels at the moment into a 5-minute, I know I went over, was difficult enough. There's an awful lot happening. You're right in saying that there is a kind of a focus at the moment on hydrogen, and a lot of that is kind of pushed as well by the kind of more industrial member states, or what we call them, where they do have this need to kind of decarbonize these, especially heavy industry, steel and this kind of thing, where they're really going to be priced out by ETS, by carbon and ETS price. I mean, just even taking the offshore wind strategy that I know that IREA has contributed to the consultation already, but this idea of a holistic approach probably fits into what Eddie is talking about. The idea that you need to make sure that the policy is aligned in terms of the marine spatial planning, the ambition on how much you want, the interconnection, the grid, everything like that, the infrastructure that's needed. And that seems to be the way they're going with this strategy in Europe now. Every strategy is only judged on its results, and we'll see how it goes. But that's the way it's going, and maybe lessons could be taken from that kind of holistic way of doing it.
And as I understand it, once these strategies are defined, this then feeds into a final Green Deal. Is that how it's envisaged, over the next 12, or even updates to the current directives? I think is like almost yeah. So the current renewable energy directives, the energy efficiency directives, all these will be almost updated on the basis of these strategies that are defined in the next 6 months, let's say.
Absolutely. I mean, it's if you just go back, say 5 years ago, there was loads of other strategies as well, that they kind of, that's, if you just take it from the silo of the European Parliament, how it happens there is that's the opportunity for everyone to kind of set their positions. And I know that's kind of the way the member states approach them as well. And they're the positions that are then taken into the actual legislative discussion. So the discussions that are ongoing now will probably shape the revisions, as you say, that are already provided for in the kind of 2030 legislation. I think 2023 is when they have to be finalised by. But also, the overall ambition. Like we're probably going to now in September see a proposal for increasing the 40 up to 55. That's a step change. That even a year ago, people wouldn't have thought that was possible, and that will just shift the ambition up on everything and get everything rolling. So, being in that discussion, I think, is really important now.
So, I think it's absolutely essential that Ireland has a voice there. And I don't know, Val and Michael, I might just point to you then. Val, you brought up route to market. You had some reflections on how does that get started, and maybe Michael, you could give some reflections back. As a TSO, how do we go from maybe thinking of a domestic challenge for our grids to a European one? I'd be very curious to just know from your own perspectives. That must be a huge shift in kind of scope for a TSO, because for the last 100 years, let's say, a TSO has pretty much managed a domestic grid. If we put 30, and dare I say, if Eddie's Wind Europe slide of 84 gigawatts, it's certainly no longer a domestic grid we're worried about. So maybe Val, if you want to reflect on route to market, and Michael, I might give it to you in terms of grids. How do we go from a 30 gigawatt world through those different strands?
Well, I think I'd have to agree entirely with Eddie's point in terms of the absolutely pivotal role of government in all of this. So, government create the enabling framework, and, reflecting back on my point about the critical path, some of the work that we did in Airwind was looking a little bit deeply at the roles and responsibilities of different government departments and agencies. And Eddie, I noted your point about 11 versus a single point of contact. I think there's one piece is that sort of the organizational structure, and sometimes it can get confusing, and it would be nicer if it was streamlined. But actually, I think even more important than that is resourcing and the personnel that are needed. So I think the priority actually is about making sure that there is enough bandwidth for civil servants and others to be able to plan and to be able to lead in relation to what's coming down the road. So in Airwind, we were talking about the need for 15 plus new personnel in the year ahead alone in the relevant departments and agencies to be able to deal with what's coming with regards to 2030, let alone beyond that with regards to offshore wind. What I would say though, and I think to be absolutely fair, I think that certainly I've been 21 years in marine resource management and very familiar in terms of the, what's happened and the pulsing of I suppose, activity around the marine area in Ireland during that period. I've never seen activity at the level that I've seen it over the last couple of years. And I think that, there's a lot going on. Sometimes we don't see the wood from the trees because we feel so frustrated. But I think full credit in relation to the National Marine Planning Framework consultation now in terms of grid connection and all of that work. Critical. If there's one take-home message for government here, it's the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill. Nothing will happen, nothing will move. Bottom fixed, floating, nothing until that is resolved. And we know the programme for government said 9 months. The clock is ticking. We know that there are some resources going into that in terms of relevant departments and agencies, but that needs to be delivered in Q1 of 2021. That is the I suppose the point from which everything follows, and really this role of government in terms of creating this enabling framework is critical. So that's starting everything. That's the Kickstarter, and then in terms of the route to market, we're looking and we see almost on a weekly or monthly basis now national hydrogen strategies coming, whether it's Australia or Germany or anywhere else. And Ireland doesn't have a hydrogen strategy. We don't have any real depth of analysis in relation to the opportunity beyond studies like Airwind and others. I really feel that the focus needs to be on how hydrogen plays a role in a route to market strategy for floating. So I think that's the granularity. I think we need to be more specific in terms of reference for what needs to happen next. And I think that's where we need to focus the attention.
Maybe just to add to that, and maybe reflecting on the comments from the different panelists and some of the presentations, some of the points that jump out to me are probably from a TSO perspective. Obviously, we've lots of relationships there, but each country at the moment has their own target. And kind of reflecting on that, we do need kind of policy change and policy evolution to move that along. I think, Eddie, reflecting on Eddie's presentation, I think we need to think big and think big in the long term and start planning now for that long-term ambition. And it's not just about the policy. It's not just about bringing the department together, having a single department. I think we need to join that up from the economic challenges I think Ireland have over the next number of years, and actually utilise effectively the tap that we have in terms of wind and offshore now as a way of kind of trying to kickstart that. The only other comment, maybe as a reflection, is I think we've come a long way in terms of how things are going in terms of offshore in the last number of years. We've got to the point now where we can actually see a future and we can see something coming down the tracks. We can get to a point of getting connection offers, getting agreements. We can see all of the different parties starting to kind of to the different things that are going to take shape. I think there's some key decisions in terms of the NPDM bill, the grid model, and then the regulatory framework that all need to come together to actually to set us up for the 2030 targets. We need to keep the focus on 2030 and be thinking of 2050. There's a risk if we just think of 2050, we're going to fall well short of our 2030. So I think there's a little bit of a balance of the short term and the long term targets we need to try and
Yeah, and I think that fits very well with what Niall was saying about the EU looking more regionally than domestically, because like if Ireland looked at a regional space, it's a totally different situation in terms of what's available to us than just looking at our own domestic setup. Like, look, there's an awful lot to digest there. I think for me, like, as you said, you referred to it, Michael, our grid policy is currently live. It just had a consultation recently. You know, Eddie's words would very strongly point to the developer-led end of that spectrum, not only in the short term, but in the long run. I know in IWEA, there was almost a reset button in terms of when the programme for government came out with the 30 gigawatt target. That's a whole new mindset to think of grid policy in versus 3-4 months ago, it was all in a 2030, 3.5 gigawatts mindset. So I think we're all kind of resetting maybe the scale of what we're thinking of here. I know, like, similarly with RAISE, like, I know Val, you mentioned RAISE, like, but RAISE has almost been always a delivery for 20, 30, 70% RESI, like a support scheme that delivers 30, 40, 50 gigawatts, to me is a EU regional, much bigger thing, wider than we've ever maybe dealt with domestically, or else, you know, just the scale of it. And again, that's why it's great to hear, Niall, of that regional thought process that may be evolving in Europe. Like a quick look at the Q&A coming through Slido, a lot of people were asking about I think NPDM you flagged, Val, crucial. I think that's coming through in the Q&A. Developer-led being crucial. I think, Eddie, you reflected on that, as in the private access developing grid. People remarked on the supply chain. I think Value highlighted in Wales, the huge, but you might want to give some reflections on the supply chain opportunity. And then one that I thought might be nice for people to wrap up on, you can refer to any of the things that I've commented on then just there, but one nice question I thought came through in the Slido is, what would be your one big advantage you can see for Ireland out of this, if you had to kind of flag one, which might be a nice way to wrap up as we edge towards 5 o'clock. So panel is open if anyone wants to come back on any of those reflections that I had and some of the things coming through on Slido.
Well, maybe I might pick up on the supply chain, David, for a second. I suppose the philosophy that we take in Simply Blue Energy is very much aligned with a cash pull study back in 2018, which looked at how to maximize the supply chain opportunity, and in the context of our floating wind project Erebus in Wales, we're taking the stepping stone approach, which was one of the recommendations from that study, which is basically, I suppose, our first project in terms of Erebus is 96 megawatts, but then there's opportunities to step and to scale from there in terms of getting to the 300 and then into full-scale commercial opportunities. I think Ireland has a small window of opportunity to follow that model in terms of supports that would look maybe initially at pre-commercial demonstration supports for floating, and then, you know, looking at it maybe in terms of 100, 300 full commercial. So that's an opportunity to, I suppose, make sure that you walk before you run and that you bring the supply chain with you, as opposed to going too big, too fast and relying on the international aspect coming into the market to help you get somewhere pretty quickly. So it's all about a balancing act, and I think the supply chain is crucial. Eddie put up some figures in relation to the impact, the job creation, the value to the economy, the value to society. It's enormous. We haven't mentioned regional development and the fact that the benefits from floating in particular can be phenomenally impactful on that Western development corridor, which for so long has almost been a correlation in terms of the economic and regional distribution of wealth in this country. I'll wait to see what the others say in relation to the one big thing, so I can try and think about that for a second. So yeah,
David,
thanks.
David, this is Eddie. I've got to go in a minute. Just to say, we have great ports in Ireland. We have big ports, we have small ports, and they're used to handling, and we have some of the best water in the world. I mean, I don't know if people realise that the port of Moneypoint and Foynes has water depth of 30 metres, just 30 metres from the shore. The whole of the east coast of the United States doesn't have that. We are set up here, if we get our act together at political level, we are set up to build an industry that is twice the size of the entire horticulture and marine industry in Ireland if we exploit our offshore wind. And I'm sorry I've got to go at that. Thanks very much.
Well, just the last bit of good news for you is Shannon Foynes will be on the same session as you at our September conference, Eddie, so they'll be delighted to hear the plug you just get from them. And thanks very much for joining. Great to have you. Niall, Michael, will I leave you to any last words of reflection, and then maybe Val will give you your one big advantage before we wrap up?
Sure, yeah. I mean, just on the question you posed, the one big advantage of Ireland, and like in kind of sort of, you know, higher level, broader terms, is, as I was saying, like there's a huge kind of ambition at EU level now to, on a couple of fronts, you know, the sort of increasing the share of renewables, meeting or achieving climate neutrality by 2050, probably 55% by 2030. And I think everyone agrees that's going to necessitate a massive increase in deployment of offshore renewables. As you mentioned at the start, David, I think our resource is the biggest advantage. As you said, there's not many regions in Europe that have this kind of a resource that we have ourselves, and Denmark, as you were saying, are probably among the best. And that's a massive opportunity, I think, for Ireland to be at the forefront in the next months and years and driving on this sort of a strategy.
Great, thanks, Niall.
Maybe just to add then, I suppose my thought and reflections on this is, I suppose there's a lot of momentum here at the moment. There's a lot of things going. We need to kind of get to certain points to make certain decisions. With the government, various different people need to make decisions on that basis, actually act and move and start delivering. The one thing I think we need to be careful of as well is we need to actually keep it open and be able to transition from one different option from the point of view of auctions or grid models, or so that we're actually thinking for 2025, 2030, 2035, 2040, and eventually to 2050, and keep all those options open, and to try to come up with a model that with the word transition is kind of central to that we can kind of take the opportunity of the experience that we have already in Ireland, look at the amount of generation that we're currently getting from wind, when we do have high wind, that's actually where we're leading in that case. So let's take advantage of that. Let's take advantage of what we have offshore, combine them together, and try to combine a level of decision making with evolution of that policy. I think we'll be in a good position.
Absolutely, can't agree more, Michael. And just for anyone who hasn't heard it, Ireland just became #1 in the world for onshore wind share, which is a phenomenal achievement for an island power system. So we've proven that when we put our mind to it, we can deliver world-leading results, which is, I think, certainly in my view, lost too much in the failure debate that sometimes wraps around Ireland's climate change agenda. Because yes, we might be a bit short on the heat side. Transport, I think we're as bad as everyone, if that's the right phase. But on electricity, it's certainly been a phenomenal achievement. I think as well, I know, Val, you're coming in 2 seconds, but I think I'll say it because I know Michael can't say it, but one of them critical decisions is all around the resourcing point you made, Val, which I think is crucial. And we know that, you know, Price Review 5 is up. That'll define the resources for the system operators for the next 5 years. I think that flexibility to do things that may be beyond any of our thinking today over the next 5 years will be critical as part of that. Because, you know, who would have thought 12 months ago we'd have been on a webinar talking about 30 gigawatts plus our domestic wind in Ireland. You know, a 5-year timeline for a budget for resource and for the crucial players like EirGrid and ESB networks. I think we're certainly going to have some kind of flexibility there that, as you said, resources are critical across all government departments, I think, to do this. So I think that's a crucial decision in the next months. That'll set us on track for the next decade. That's 5 years at least. And then Val, if you have any last words yourself,
I was just trying to summarize what might be the most impactful thing from unleashing floating wind and the 30 gigawatts in an Irish context. I'd say it's about future proofing. So just going back to that Ardna Crusher thing, that set us up. Floating is potentially going to future-proof us in terms of a sustainable and an energy security future. And I think it's really about getting out of this mentality of being a small island nation. We're talking offshore now, we're going to be a large ocean state, and that's what floating will provide for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I think that is definitely, even from my own personal journey, a mindset shift in everything you think about in terms of the tools and levers that we'll have to build on. Thinking of Ireland as solving an Irish solution is so different to thinking of Ireland as solving an EU solution. So look, just if there's the vast majority of people are still with us, if anyone still has access to Slido, we'll rerun the polls we had at the start. And just while people are going on to Slido and doing that, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone to give their time, the panelists for giving their time with us for the hour, as well as the hour that went into prepping and getting all the IT systems up and running. Really appreciate your time. I think it's the start of a long discussion. Like IWEA, to try and complement this discussion, like as I said, Val is head of our new floating offshore working group. The other piece of work we've just closed a tender on is putting together a zero carbon scenario for Ireland for 2050. You know, we very much want to start informing our members and informing the debate around what does the long-term picture look like? What mix of, you know, connection to Europe, production of fuels, locating high-end users can we envisage over the next 20 years? Because it was great to hear, Michael, that like EirGrids, yes, we all have to focus on 2030, and that is the delivery decade ahead of us, but we need to be mindful of the post-2030 picture, let's say, that's coming rapidly around the corner once we pass that critical milestone. So it looks like the direct connection to Europe is still very much leading the way. So that's the first one. In terms of timelines, I wonder, did we get any faster? Or actually, it might be a good time for me to break the IT system right as we, yeah, it looks like I've, oh no, there it is. So if anyone is still on Slido, maybe we can see if for the last 30 seconds, if there's been any change to timelines. No, it looks like the 2040 timeline is still, and I think that fits well with a lot of our discussions here, where like 2030 is probably the building blocks for the post 2030 delivery phase, while delivery for the next decade is most likely the 70% domestic targets that we're predominantly focused on, but certainly a lot of building blocks to be put in place immediately, especially it sounds like in the EU space, Niall, where there's just so many discussions taking place, like in the same way that the clean energy package is really shaping a lot of what we have on our doorstep right now. It feels like a lot of the conversations you're having in Brussels between the strategies, the Green Deal, and the revisions to directives coming in the next 12 months is certainly going to leave a lasting legacy for the number of years to come. So on that, look at a final thanks to everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time. It's a busy period for everyone, I know, and I'm sure we'll have many a discussion to come in the coming years, and the next one at our September conference in the end of September. So hopefully see many of you there. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, David. Thanks a lot.